Thank you. Great. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I think what we'll do, I wanted to start with just a brief review of the things that we talked about last night, and but what we'll do first of all is start with just a brief meditation, a brief reflection. And what we do generally when we start any kind of Buddhist teaching or meditation session, or even if we're studying on our own, is to set our intention to reflect on our motivation. And so we say we get more out of any activity that we do, any Dharma activity, especially if we've really set a clear motivation and a clear intention. So I'm just going to guide you through a brief contemplation. I'll just prompt you with some things to think about, and then we'll just reflect a little bit on our intention for being here. So first, just find a comfortable posture and sit comfortably in a way that's relaxed yet alert. These two qualities are not contradictory, they're complementary, relaxation and alertness. And after you've settled a comfortable posture, just for a few moments, just let your awareness settle on the breath, the rhythm of the breathing, the sensations of the breathing in the body. Wherever the sensations seem the most apparent, it might be the sensations in the abdomen, or in the chest with the lungs expanding and contracting, or perhaps the sensations in the nostrils, the subtlest place that you can notice the sensations. So just for a few moments, settle the mind after settling the body by just attending to the sensations of the breath. And if you feel your attention starts to wander to a thought, get carried away, or a sound outside, just very gently, the moment you notice that you're distracted, just bring your attention back to the sensations of the breath. And as we embark on this journey of cultivating emotional balance, ask yourself, what's called you to be here? What inspired you to take this course? And don't think your way through this too analytically, but just take the time to, whatever arises from the depths of your being, from your own intuition, without thinking it through too analytically. When you ask yourself the question, why am I here? What inspired me? What interested me in this subject? What comes up for you? and knowing that our thoughts and our emotions have a powerful influence on how we interact with others. Ask yourself, what benefit would I like to bring about by cultivating my heart and mind? Okay, so let's take just a minute to review what we talked about yesterday. So we started out by talking a little bit about kind of this idea in cultivating emotional balance of this idea of happiness. And we discussed kind of two different domains of happiness. Does anybody remember what those two kind of types of happiness that we talked about a little bit last night? You might not remember the Greek words, but can you describe? Yeah, and tell me your name. Brian. Yeah, Brian. Okay, so explain a little bit more. Internal and external in terms of what? Yeah, yeah. So we had those two different ones. The one that kind of comes more from like sensory enjoyment, right? So comes from experiences we can have of the, people, places, things, events, objects outside. Anybody remember the Greek word for that? Yes. Hedonic, right? And so we know that word when you think of like a hedonist or something like that. Sometimes you'll say, oh, you're such a hedonist if somebody just likes to party all the time or something like that. And then the other one, more happiness that comes from inside, right? And one way of thinking of it is happiness that comes from what you can kind of get from the world versus happiness that comes from a quality of being that you bring to the world, more. And we talked about that, and, some of you reflected that you feel happy when you're serving others, so you're bringing kind of that quality of being, of really helping other people. People mentioned relationships, really connecting with other people in close relationships. So it's this kind of thing that we think of as kind of a deeper sense of well-being, not so dependent on the fluctuations of external circumstance, because one of the problems with that hedonic pleasure, if anything is dependent on something from the outside that we don't have any control over, guess what? We're not going to have it all the time. I mean, the Buddha talked about this too. Since we're here at Kurukulla, I'm allowed to mention Buddhism. Sometimes colleagues of mine teach cultivating emotional balance at places like Goldman Sachs, and then they can't mention the B word. But since I've got the outfit and we're in the setting, I'm allowed to mention the B word. And, the Buddha talked about suffering, the truth of suffering. We'll talk Friday night, for those of you doing that class, about what that word really means. I don't really like suffering as the translation, but what he was talking about is we don't get what we want, we get what we don't want, and this is my personal favorite, we get what we thought we wanted, and it's kind of like, wah, wah, that's it. It's disappointing. And so that's kind of our relationship with external things, isn't it? We don't get them when we think we want them. We get the things that we don't want, and even the things that we thought we wanted when we get them, they can ultimately be like super disappointing. So that's a drag if our happiness just depended on that alone, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about. Not that there's anything wrong with the chocolate cake and the sensory pleasures at all, but if that's the only route to happiness, we're just setting ourselves up for disappointment. Whereas if there's happiness that kind of comes from a deeper quality of being and service and so forth, and I think, the heroes that we all think about, there's always this short list of our heroes in life, and like Mahatma Gandhi and the Dalai Lama and Martin Luther King. I just put Mother Teresa on the list, and I got really in a lot of trouble. Somebody in New York sent me all these links to all of these things about Mother Teresa really wasn't as much of a saint as we think because she did this, that, and the other. And I said, well, it's the principle still of the selfless service. Okay, there's details and there's controversy now, but still there's this thing of really, sacrificing her own comfort for the benefit. Maybe there's questions about what she did and was it really beneficial or not, but still the fact is, it's, this idea of really kind of going out and bringing the best of yourself to the world. So that's this more kind of genuine well-being, genuine happiness. Eudaimonia is this word that Aristotle coined for this kind of flavor of happiness. So we talked about that. And then we started talking about emotions. And we had a very kind of lengthy, specific definition of emotion. Anybody remember any of the components of that definition of what an emotion actually is? You don't have to have it at all word for word, but anybody remember any of the aspects of that definition of emotion? So what are parts of it? Yeah, sudden onset, right? So those were some of the characteristics of it. It had a sudden onset, but it was this kind of a process, right, of responding. Automatic appraisal, remember that part of it? We said we're not thinking. When we're emotional, we automatically appraise. And I gave the example of like the leaf skittering across the street. You don't go through this whole thing. You just slam your brakes on, right? So it bypasses cognitive thought. It's this automatic appraisal where something important to your welfare is taking place, right? So that's when we become emotional, when we're appraising really automatically that something important to our welfare is taking place. And then an emotion kind of coordinates those various response systems. We've got a physiological response that goes along with that, often physiological changes in the body. Somebody was mentioning last night sensations, feeling different sensations in the body, right, with emotions. And that's one of the things that we can learn that helps us learn what our emotions actually are. Some people feel the physiological changes before they're really aware mentally that they're feeling an emotion. So those were some of the characteristics of emotion. So I'll just reread the definition. Emotion is a process, a particular kind of automatic appraisal influenced by our evolutionary and personal past, in which we sense that something important to our welfare is occurring. It includes a set of physiological changes and behaviors that begin to deal with the situation. In particular, emotions are thought to have arisen because they effectively coordinate diverse response systems, thereby helping us respond to important challenges and opportunities. Okay, so that was the definition. And remember, we had that part of the evolutionary and personal past. So there's certain stimuli that every human being will respond to, right? It's just part of our evolutionary past. And then there's a lot that's personal to us, which is why we often become emotional about things, and our friends are like, what's going on? Or vice versa, right? Somebody else in your life will be very emotional about some stimulus, and you just won't understand because it's something triggering. We're going to look more at that tonight. So is the point to get rid of our emotions as good Buddhists? Do we need to somehow get rid of our emotions? Brian thinks not. Why not, Brian? Yeah. Did we have any reason behind that? We did. You're absolutely right. We did say that. Well, from the definition, it sounds like they're pretty useful, right? It's coordinating these response systems. Something important to your welfare is happening. You have this automatic appraisal for a reason. We evolved them, right? So they can save our lives. That's one of the functions of emotions. That's a pretty important function. They can actually save our lives. They motivate us to act, and they help us communicate with other people. And we're going to be looking at that when we look at these universal signals of emotion. You know, they communicate. Pre-verbal human beings communicated a lot through emotions and facial expressions of emotions, and that's why they're universal. And that was the big breakthrough. We talked about Paul Ekman's research, the big breakthrough when he went to Papua New Guinea, and we'll look at some slides of his research of these, you know, villagers in this uncontacted tribe, and he says, you know, show me the face that you'd make if you found a dead, smelly pig in the forest. And they make exactly the same face that you guys are sort of making right now, just because I said that sentence, exactly the same disgust face, right? So universal signals of many emotions. He talks about 7 that have a universal signal, so we'll look at that. And then we talked about constructive and destructive, and we said we don't use so much the language of positive and negative in terms of how does it feel to us subjectively to be feeling it, because that doesn't really say whether it's constructive or destructive. So what was a constructive emotion? Anybody remember? Oh, you were just moving. I saw a hand go up over there. Anybody remember? Constructive in terms of what? Yeah, Annette.
Anger, if the outcome is positive, like, shouting at your toddler when you're crossing the road.
Yeah, so we can have an emotion that doesn't feel good, but serves a function that's actually constructive, right?
But I was surprised that nobody mentioned like love yesterday. Like that's like a that's the obvious like constructive emotion. Right?
You know, love.
Although it could be destructive.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, love is not considered an emotion. It's more of a state that has many emotions in with it. It's kind of like we were talking about grief, and we said grief is complex. There's sadness in there, there's happiness in there. Is love just one thing? Is it fleeting? Is it, short-lived? Does it come on suddenly? It's more of a state of being that can have a whole lot of emotions in there. We talked about jealousy, the young man who mentioned jealousy last night. Sometimes love involves jealousy. Sometimes it involves sadness. There are a lot of emotions. So it's more of a state. It's not really considered to be kind of one emotion in the sense of like being fleeting in that same way. So love and compassion aren't actually considered emotions. They have emotional content in them, but they're not that automatic appraisal and that kind of automatic response like that. But yeah, that's something that comes up quite a lot. But the constructive and destructive, we say that an emotion can be constructive if it leads to our own and others' welfare and improves like communication and cooperation between people. Destructive, the opposite of that. So anger and yelling at your child for running into the street and actually having an angry response, that would be a constructive, unpleasant feeling. So sometimes we talk about anger as being a negative emotion, but it doesn't mean we never want to have anger. It removes an obstacle, right? It's just about how constructively do we behave when we're angry. And anger is one of the ones, and we'll talk more about that next week. We'll talk a lot about anger. So anger is one of the ones that's so easily extremely destructive, and when I was taking the Cultivating Emotional Balance course, of course we're taught in Buddhism, even 1 second of anger destroys all of this positive karma, and I was so conditioned in my Buddhist training to like, no, anger is never good. But it's interesting. anger can mean a lot of different things in English, and only one of those meanings is what they're talking about in Buddhism when they talk about the destructiveness of anger. So we'll talk about that more next week. And then what about a destructive emotion that feels good? I don't even want to call it a destructive positive emotion, but one that, feels pleasant to feel, but is destructive. We had a couple of examples last night. Anybody remember? Yeah, Schadenfreude. So that's like delighting in others' suffering. Then we had a discussion before class about the National Enquirer and all the different Buddhist uses of the National Enquirer to remind us of the sufferings of samsara, and that we can't find happiness no matter how rich and famous we are, which is another good use of it. But it's also a trigger for Schadenfreude, I think, for a lot of people, just, being happy in other suffering. So that's an obvious example of one that we actually do take delight. I was teaching Cultivating Emotional Balance at the Canadian Mental Health Association in Canada, where I used to live, and I had a big class of about 26 people, a lot of mental health workers, addiction counselors, school teachers. It was really the kind of the perfect group for cultivating emotional balance. And there was this one man, when I gave the list of the enjoyable emotions, Schadenfreude is one of the 16 enjoyable emotions. And he took great exception to that because he was a Buddhist student, and he said, oh, it's non-virtuous, therefore it can't be enjoyable. And we had a big discussion about that. And I think he was mostly upset because he was the only German person in the room, and it was the only enjoyable emotion that was a German word. So he's like, no, it's not. And I was like, no, you're brainwashed by Buddhism. Believe me, people that take delight in other suffering, it does really feel enjoyable for them. And he was like, no, it's non-virtuous. And I'm like, take your Buddhist hat off. That has nothing to do with it. So the difference between constructive and destructive. So let's start looking at some of these, the big 7 universal emotions, and this comes out of Paul Ekman's research in Papua New Guinea. And so these are some of the 7 that have a universal signal in terms of the facial expression. Now, there's a lot of research now being done on the voice because different emotions have different vocal signals also, and that's budding research that's happening right now. But Paul Ekman in the 60s, for his PhD research, identified these 7. And well, look, enjoyable emotions, there's 16 in that family of enjoyable emotions. They're grouped together because they have one universal facial signal for all of them, which is what, do you think? The smile. Yeah. Almost all of the enjoyable emotions. There's a couple of exceptions because awe has a different facial signal of the mouth kind of opening and the eyes opening. This sort of look of, there's emojis are great for this, by the way, because they really capture in like a couple of lines exactly the facial expressions of these emotions. And awe is a little bit different, but for many of the enjoyable emotion, a smile is the signal for that, the universal signal, and it's the facial expression that can be seen from farther away than any of the rest. And why is that important? Yeah, friend or foe. Remember, our emotions evolved when we were living in little bands of 150 people that were all related somehow and communicated with each other. So if you saw someone from another band or troop coming, you wanted to know from pretty far away before they could hurl their spear, are they friendly or not? So you could see the smile that evolved to show. Now, you can fake a smile, and we'll talk about that. What's a fake smile and what's a genuine smile? Because there's differences. Yeah, Annette.
Just as far, and not to, I don't want to add to the confusion, but I have heard several Russians say that smiling is not really culturally acceptable in Russia.
There are huge,
vulnerability or something like that, or to be
yeah.
less to smile.
And there are huge differences in what we call display rules of expression. So that's another thing. There are these universal facial expressions, and on top of that, to muddy the water, as you said, there's huge, huge differences in display rules between cultures, between genders, big time in different countries. What does a smile mean? I taught, when I was teaching this, I mentioned last night with my 50 gang members, they were like, oh no, a smile does not mean a friend is coming, because it's like a challenge for them. And it depends on who's smiling at you. If it's like your 3 best friends, it means something good. If it's anybody else in prison, it means you're going to sharpen something and try and stab them the next time. So that's a cultural thing. There was this interesting display rule, and I have the slide, I could maybe put it in for next time, of a study that was done in California and in Japan, in Tokyo. And so they showed film to this, American college student and a Japanese college student, and they showed a film that invoked disgust, this film that's often shown showing like a burn victim, and they're kind of peeling the skin off a burn victim, and so it's very, evocative of a disgust response. And so they showed the students sitting in a room by themselves watching the film, and they showed their faces, and they're both just going, the disgust is like curling the lip and wrinkling the nose and just, ooh. Then in both places, in both Berkeley and Tokyo, a lab assistant walked in wearing a white lab coat. The American made a worse disgust face after the person in the white coat came in. In Japan, because of the whole thing about authority, the student tried to mask the disgust by smiling, because he didn't want to show a negative emotion in front of an authority figure, right? So that was just one example, but big time cultural differences. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are these universals, and what do we mask when, in front of who, and what's culturally acceptable, and all of that is a long, long, long story that's just starting to be. People make fun of Americans. Europeans make total fun of us for hi, how are you? Oh, it's great to see you. They're just like, oh my God, you only smile at your best. People from other countries, they just think we're ridiculous, that we're always totally smiling. I remember Lama Zopa, our teacher, said he thought everybody who worked in a Dharma center needed to be like an American waitress. Like he thought it was just so over the top. You go into a restaurant and hi, can I help you? They're at your elbow every 5.5 nanoseconds. Is there anything else you need? Can I help you more? Like, what do you want? What can I do for you? And he's like, that's great. Everybody who greets people in a Dharma center should be like an American waitress. So yeah, culturally there are a lot of differences for that. Yeah, but it is a universal, a spontaneous enjoyment does invoke a smile, unless we're masking for some cultural reason. We'll look later at the 16 enjoyable emotions. And then fear, also a universal. What's the facial expression of fear? Right? So it's this kind of grimace of the mouth. The eyes are kind of going big, but the brows a little bit down, right? So fear, this sort of grimace expression. Sadness or anguish, we talked about this last night. The bottom of the mouth, the corners kind of go down. And then this thing that Annette was able to do that's really hard to do. She does it great. The eyebrows, it's really hard to do unless you actually feel sad. The inside of your eyebrows kind of go up. Everybody turn around and look at Annette right now. She's doing a perfect sad face. And the little wrinkles right here on the forehead. It's really hard to do. But that's the sadness face. And then surprise. What's the universal facial expression for surprise? Right? So you open your eyes wide, right? But it's not like the fear, which is a little bit more concern in the forehead and wrinkled in the brows down. You're opening your mouth. You're trying to get as much data in as possible, because what's happening with surprise, you're trying to evaluate the situation. And we say, surprise is the most short-lived emotion, and it almost immediately goes to another emotion. right? It could go to fear, it could go to disgust, it could go to happiness, it could go to any number of other, anger, but you're trying to take in information. So like the whole face is just opening up. You're like, what's that? Just open like that. And then disgust, we just had that. It's always, it's just a lifting of the upper lip, kind of a crinkling of the nose. It can be very, very subtle. So they don't have to be as exaggerated as what I'm doing. They can be subtle. And then anger. What does an anger face look like? Okay, the lady in the back. What's your name? You're doing a great anger face. The very, very back in front of the air conditioner. Yeah, what's your name?
No, I'm not. My family gives me a hard time about the face I make.
You're pressing your lips together. And that's kind of what, so the subtle one could just be kind of like, right? So you're thin, your lips are kind of pressed together, a little bit thin. Can be more exaggerated than that if you're really mad. You can kind of be grimacing too, in a way. It's not sort of like the fear one, but you can actually kind of have your mouth open and almost baring your teeth. And then your brows are going down. And so it's kind of the opposite from the sadness one. You're sort of furrowing your brows and kind of glaring with your eyes. And then contempt. This is an interesting one. What's a contempt face? Yeah, looking down your nose. It's one of the ones that's asymmetric, because you kind of have a sneer. You're a little bit like. So you usually lift like the lip on one side. It's the only expression of these universals that George H.W. Bush had this great contempt face that he showed all the time. Even when he's trying to like give a speech to allies, he would be showing this contempt face, which was just like so. I've got a slide of him doing it, so it's this great contempt face. So those are the 7 universals. Now, they're universal in terms of certain characteristics. The signal, the trigger or the theme, the physiological response, and the likely actions. And it doesn't mean by any means that those 7 emotions are the only emotions at all, right? What are some other emotions that are probably universally experienced by human beings? What do you think? Others? Yeah, shame. We talked about jealousy last night, right? Probably universal. What else? That's in the fear family. That's kind of a brand. And by the way, all of these that we talked about are families of emotion, right? So there are a lot of different ones, with the possible exceptions of disgust and contempt. But for example, for fear, you can have like anxiety on one end, terror on the other end, and a lot of different, emotions. If we had more time, we could brainstorm words. Anger, same thing, goes all the way from like mild irritation and annoyance all the way to rage, would be on the other kind of extreme of that. But things like pride, jealousy, shame, probably also universally felt. But we didn't evolve a universal signal for those. We didn't really want people to know that we were feeling ashamed or jealous necessarily. Although shame, that's one that there's a debate. Because as I mentioned last night, this researcher says, we do kind of look down and expose our neck. There's this sort of movement, not so much a facial expression, but a little bit of a movement that goes along with shame, and that's a little bit debated. But for example, pride could have an element of contempt to it, but not necessarily. Jealousy wouldn't really. We might not want people to know that we're feeling jealous, so that might be one that didn't evolve a facial expression because of that. But these 7, really universally found, and that's been studied now from the time of Paul Ekman pretty well, and pretty much agreed upon among the different scientists. So any questions about those 7? Yes?
I was just thinking that, I'm not sure this is universal, but guilt. I look at that as an emotion. I'm wondering if that, well, kind of fear in some ways, because when you're feeling
Right.
guilty about something, sometimes it's like you're afraid you're gonna get caught.
That's right, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think it could have an element of shame often in there,
Shame.
and possibly, like you say, fear of getting caught. So guilt could be a little bit complex. It could have a couple of things going on in there. You know, sometimes when people are guilty, they get angry and defensive. So sometimes that's a way that people respond. And in fact, we're going to talk more about anger. And one of the things about anger, it can often be a secondary emotion to something that's even more basic that we don't want to feel, so we feel anger instead. Often people get angry when they feel afraid, because when we think about anger removing an obstacle, because that's really its theme, we're removing the obstacle of feeling afraid by feeling angry. Even though it kind of sucks to feel angry, it's worse to feel the vulnerability of fear. You know, and guilt too. I think sometimes when people feel guilty, you know, there's a bit of bravado and defensiveness that can kind of manifest a bit as anger, because it doesn't feel great to feel shame, you know, and guilt, and so it can manifest a little bit as anger. So anger is one of the interesting ones, and when we get there, we'll look at that, because I think in dealing with our own and others' anger, it can be useful to always question, hey, is there something more fundamental going on? When we're trying to deal with our own anger and manage our own anger, it's important to be aware of, is there a root emotion that's even more basic? Maybe fear, maybe sadness, maybe some kind of vulnerability, because then we're dealing with the real cause and not the manifestation of anger. You know, a lot of people, especially Buddhists, try to apply all the antidotes to anger. Sometimes it doesn't work, because anger is not the most fundamental thing that they're really feeling. It's masking an even more deeper vulnerability often. So yeah, that's interesting, and I think it can be true for guilt too. Yeah.
I don't know where I learned this or heard this, but I've been told that in the Tibetan language, they have no word for
That's what I've heard too.
So I thought, well,
Yeah.
isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, yeah. I was teaching once this big international group in India, in Bodh Gaya, and it was about 60 people in this big introductory class, and I had heard that too, and I said it. I said, I heard in the languages of Buddhism, like Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, Chinese, whatever, there isn't a word that completely corresponds to the word guilt. There's regret, because I was explaining purification practices, and I was saying there's a difference between regret and guilt, and there isn't this word for guilt. And I remember there was a student from Brazil sitting right in front of me, and he raised his hand and he goes, I don't believe it. I don't believe they don't have guilt. I don't believe there's nobody who doesn't have guilt. So, okay, let's check. Because it was an international class, we had, I think, 5 or 6 people from Asian countries there. We had a woman from Thailand, a woman from Korea, a woman from India, a man from Bhutan, a woman from Nepal, I think, and maybe one other. So we're talking about this cultural thing of Western Judeo-Christian culture, guilt, and we're discussing, and it was interesting because, you know, we got into this whole big discussion, and then one person said, okay, he asked, I think the Korean woman, when you do something wrong, what's the emotion that you feel? Like, what do you feel when you do something wrong that hurts somebody or something? She said, she was really great, and she was super into the class. She didn't speak English very well, like she really understood well. She didn't speak well, and she said, I feel like inside I'm really Buddha, and I made a mistake. And the Brazilian guy's like, you do? Like, what would that feel like? You know? So it's sort of, and sometimes in Buddhism we talk about Buddha nature versus original sin. You know, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche used to talk about original goodness. You know, there's this whole idea. So the Brazilian guy, he really worked on this for years. We got to be really close friends, and he would come see me wherever I was. He was a famous mountain climber, like the first Brazilian to climb Mount Everest and all these high mountains or whatever. So he traveled all the time, and he'd come see me. And about 5 years later, he said, I finally figured it out, the guilt, regret thing. I was like, what? So simple. Guilt is, I'm bad. Regret is that thing that I did was harmful or not beneficial. So it's very, very different kind of qualitatively between guilt and regret, so that's a big difference, and we're going to be talking about regret over the weekend when we talk about karma, because it's one of the ways we purify, but it doesn't mean we sit around going, oh, I'm so terrible, forget it, I might as well just give up completely because I'm a horrible person, which is more kind of the flavor of guilt, I think. Yeah. All right. So, universal signal in the facial signal for these 7. There's a theme, and we'll look at that next. There's a physiological response, and we talked about that a little bit. For some of them, for example, anger, the blood rushes to your hands, preparing you to fight. For fear, the blood rushes to your legs, preparing you to run, and other your heart starts pounding with a lot of fear, for example, both of them, fear and anger. Your heart starts pounding. Often for anger, there's like a flush to the face, and the blood kind of rushes to the face. So different physiology and different likely actions motivated by the different emotions. So let's look at the themes of the 7 universal emotions. So anger, the theme is to remove an obstacle. So that's the real fundamental theme of anger, is removing some kind of obstacle. They've done studies of infants, and Eve Ekman, Paul Ekman's daughter, who's also an emotions researcher, she talks about the golden age of psychological research before there was a lot of constraints in terms of kind of what was okay to do or not. And apparently they did a study on 6-month-old infants, and they swore that it didn't harm the infants at all, but what they did was hold their arms behind their little backs and put a really brightly colored toy in front of them that they wanted to play with, and then they're holding their arms back, and we're all like, oh no, that's terrible. But apparently the infants made these perfect anger faces, and were like, just manifested total full-on anger because there was an obstacle for them to get to the brightly colored toy. And then the experimenters were like, no, it didn't harm them at all. And I'm like, yeah, 25 years later, they're going to be in therapy behind that experiment that you did. So, removing an obstacle, you can think of things like road rage. Perfect example, right? Some obstacle in terms of another car gets in front of you or stops you from getting what you want. And then in terms of anger being a secondary emotion, like I said, the obstacle being another emotion, especially anything to do with vulnerability that you'd really rather not feel, right? And this is also very gendered too. We talked about display rules, and I think for men, much more acceptable to feel anger than it is for women and a lot of other emotions. There's a great movie, and I haven't seen the movie, I've just seen the trailer, called The Mask You Live In. And it's all about how boys are raised to, be a man, man up, don't cry, don't be a sissy. All of the ways culturally that boys are raised not to express lots of their emotional repertoire, and what a, terrible toll this is kind of taking on. I really recommend it. Like I said, I've only seen the trailer, and I haven't seen the movie, just came out recently, but it's called The Mask You Live In, and it's all about those display rules. So I think for anger, it's definitely gendered a bit about, whether it's okay to express fear, to escape from a threat. Flight is the theme, and then sadness, to be reassured, eliciting connection in the face of a shared loss, creating connection in the face of loss. And also it just makes us realize that we've lost something that's really important to us when we experience sadness. Disgust, to get rid of something poisonous or harmful. Now, there's physical disgust, there's also social disgust that has exactly the same facial expression. When someone does something that is socially disgusting, that seems demeaning, debasing, and so forth, there's a researcher, two researchers, there's a researcher, Paul Rosen, who's the foremost researcher on disgust, and one of his students as a psychologist by the name of Jonathan Haidt, and he started by studying social disgust, the emotion of social disgust, which has the same facial expression, and that led him to studying the emotion of what he calls elevation, which is one of the enjoyable emotions, and that's the inspired feeling that we get when we see someone else do something virtuous. So he says there's a continuum between, on the one hand, social disgust, which happens, think of a child molester, for example, somebody who would be very much evoke, a social disgust. And then on the other hand, somebody doing something very virtuous and self-sacrificing that, really serves others. Elevation is the enjoyable emotion we get when we're in the face of someone showing great kindness or great self-sacrifice or really helping people. And then virtue is the pole. So sometimes he talks about the three axes of social connection. He talks about relationship, hierarchy, and then this pole he calls the axis of divinity. And he draws an interesting relationship. He talks about religious fundamentalism. And he said, what religious fundamentalists are bemoaning is the flattening of our social world into two dimensions. Or in America, it's mostly one. It's mostly relationship. We don't even have much hierarchy built into our culture, not as much as, many other cultures. And then the whole thing of divinity. Actually, Les and I were talking about this yesterday when we talk about when you travel in other countries and you see kind of the holy everywhere, like India. You see sadhus everywhere, temples, people making offerings. It's just surrounding you. And I say, I always have this feeling when I come back to the U.S. from being in India of like, wow, there's really this thing missing. It's like the secular West, there's definitely this thing missing. So what Jonathan Haidt says is religious fundamentalists are trying to get this third dimension back. The only problem is they're trying to get it on their terms. And that's the fault. But it is a human need to have this kind of pole of the sacred, and then on the opposite side is social disgust. So it's very interesting. Jonathan Haidt's written two books, one called The Happiness Hypothesis, and one is called The Righteous Mind, and it's this exploration of what he calls the moral emotions. So can't recommend it enough. It's brilliant, brilliant book. So disgust. So getting rid of something poisonous or harmful, even, emotionally or conceptually in the sense of social disgust. And then contempt, and that's an interesting one, another one of the universals. Sorry, this keeps falling off because my thing, I'll just hold it in my lap. It keeps kind of pulling off my Madonna headpiece thing. Asserting superiority, okay? So establishing hierarchy, asserting superiority. Why would contempt be constructive, do you think? And why did we evolve contempt? Anybody have a guess? What's the function of contempt to, why is asserting superiority a good thing? And why did we evolve that as human beings? Anybody have a guess? And think about also that all of these are also found in our primate cousins, too. Yeah. It's all about that, yeah. So think about, a troop of gorillas, and you've got the alpha male. If every time a juvenile came and pounded its chest and tried to, assert its superiority over the alpha male, if every time the alpha male had to fight, that would be a huge waste of resources and energy. But he doesn't have to. All he does is go, yeah, right, you are not even worth my time. So he does a contempt, facial expression and contempt signal saves a huge amount of energy. He doesn't have to fight. They don't have to waste as a troop the resources of all the food and so forth and, the junior ones getting injured and all of that. So it saves energy. To assert superiority through contempt, So that's how it evolved. Of course, Now, teenagers are perfect at contempt, aren't they? Because they're trying desperately to assert some superiority over the grown-ups, so sometimes it's not so functional in that way. It's interesting, one of my co-teachers of Cultivating Emotional Balance is a father of two school-age boys, and when we were studying together, the teacher training, he goes, wow, I really realized how much I use contempt to discipline my boys. He said, we'll be in a restaurant, they'll be a little loud and rowdy, and I'll go, okay, boys, settle down. And if they don't, he says, I'll just totally make the contempt face at them. And then they shut up. It's like, whoa, I use contempt for discipline. It was like, well, it could be worse, and it sort of works. But all of that is the function, because we are hierarchical human beings. What some of the psychologists and the researchers say, that in these egalitarian cultures, like hunter-gatherer cultures like the San Bushmen are like famously egalitarian, but they need to exert so much energy to dismiss and dispense with hierarchy. It keeps reasserting itself, and then they keep trying to like squash hierarchy. It just seems to constantly be asserting itself. So this is the function of contempt. And then surprise, focusing attention to identify something. And remember I said that surprise is the quickest acting emotion, and it usually immediately transforms into something else, into one of the other emotions. And then enjoyable emotions deepen connection and cooperation. And you think about when you're sharing a laugh with your friends, how much that really deepens that social connection that you have with others. So these are the themes. Any questions about these themes of the emotions? Yeah, Annette.
Is worry an emotion, or is that like a
I think it's kind of in the fear family along with anxiety, because we're being fearful in advance of something even happening, but it relates to the fear family like anxiety does, Or we're, it's a cognitively induced, it's induced by thought, right? So, the thought of what might happen, or that thing that was so unpleasant happens again, that invokes fear. So it's one that's prompted not by an external stimulus, but more by a thought. Yeah. Any other questions about those 7? Yes?
That's neutral, that you don't, like I'm sitting here learning, and
Yeah.
is there an emotion for that?
Probably not. I mean, there might be fleeting emotions of, oh, that was funny, or, oh, that was so interesting, or surprise, like maybe I said something about contempt that you didn't know before, so there's maybe a fleeting emotion. So you can have kind of very subtle fleeting emotions, even when you're doing something like just sitting, taking in a lecture like that. Or maybe I said something you disagree with and you had a momentary little irritation. So that can happen, just very, very fleeting, and they may not necessarily prompt any kind of action at all, but it's just kind of comes up for you in a fleeting way. Yeah. Did you have something, Brian, or were you just adjusting? Okay, I saw some motion happening over there. All right, let's look at some of the faces of the emotions from Paul Ekman's research. Then we'll take a little break, and then we'll look at the emotional episode timeline, and we'll then spend the rest of the time looking at that timeline. Uh-oh, what's happening? I'm frozen. Don't freeze. Pardon me, technical difficulties. Okay. Sorry about that. Not quite sure what's happening here. All right, let's take our break now, and I'll deal with my technical difficulties. Just take about 10 minutes to stretch, get a drink of water, and then we'll come back, and hopefully I can get this one working again. No.
Yeah.
We'll see. I mean, it's not the end of the world. I got a handout, so.
I mean, you can, instead of advance, you can like go back to that menu and click on the image that you want.
Yeah, that's what I did.
Yeah.
That's what I did, and that's what I did.
Yeah. It just sometimes
Yeah, it's
having
weird.
those glitches.
Why do we have that glitch? But that was one slide where I had it set up so that every, you clicked and then the next kind of line, and
Yeah.
maybe that confused it. I'm not sure. Anyway, at least that worked. No, I'm good. I might need some
Waitress.
It's warm up here with all this talking. Are you guys hot? Okay, I always just get wound up. Don't mind me. Yeah, it does. All the Bible. But I don't want to freeze you guys out. I'm fine. That always happens.
Taller table, so hopefully that's,
That would be good, actually, because it's just enough so it keeps kind of.
I changed it already.
Oh, you did? Great, thank you.
So
Did
hopefully
you do?
that's.
Oh, when I was fussing with my thing. Thank you very
I
much. I
changed it,
think
and
that'll.
put the cable right behind you.
Yeah.
And that should hopefully be enough.
Right. That's, it wasn't doing it last night, but tonight it just keeps kind of ripping off my ear. I asked for the other kind of mic for the weekend because it's sort of, hard on the ear to have it on for a whole day. Sort of
What kind of,
uncomfortable. So the man was here last night, said he was gonna just set up, or I don't know if you've got a tie clip mic. Those are pretty good, but you might not have that. But I think just a regular mic, yeah.
the other thing we can do is we can put the cable on the other table, which is taller, and then put it behind you.
Okay. I moved it because there was a lot of stuff on this
So
table.
that's
I
enough.
think it should be okay, Sean. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's inside the window, when you pull that down, it's inside the upper part, it's just in the upper part of it. Well,
Well, this, it's funny because he's a really good friend of mine, and he just went into doing cultivating emotional balance in, business settings, and he said, oh, Goldman Sachs, and I go, oh, I'll go with you, and he goes, oh, I don't know if you could handle it, and I go, oh, I don't know if they could handle it. And he goes, you're probably right about that. It's like, I don't think you can handle it. I'm like, trust me, I can handle anything. It's them. I'm like, yeah. It's always one of those things that's sort of like teaching mindfulness meditation to the executives at Monsanto. There's always like this ethical someone that comes up with something like that. Like, something they're going to be able to more mindfully, like design things that will, make even more farmers in the third world commit suicide. Oh, really? Who's yeah, under fire. God's work. Is that what the Wells Fargo guy said last week in Congress? I loved Elizabeth Warren. She just tore into him like nobody's business. I was like, oh, I wish Hillary had chosen her as her running. That would have been see, I haven't looked yet at the so-called highlights of the vice presidential debate. They just seem like such kind of non-entity figures.
Probably the,
Yeah.
yeah, it was nasty.
Was it?
So I heard, I didn't watch it, but
Yeah.
it was horribly.
I didn't watch the first presidential debate. I just watched like the 7-minute so-called highlights.
Yeah.
I didn't think I could really handle 90 whole minutes of that.
My contempt face.
Yes, the Oh, I should see if I can find one on the break. I should see if I can find the H.W. Bush's concept. Yeah, he did that a lot.
Yeah, the lip curl was.
Yeah, yeah, and you can see kind of the unilateral, yes. And then Simon Cowell is pretty good at picking up kind of thing.
That can also be used in humor, too. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, how you perceive
Yes,
them,
right.
and when it becomes,
Is what
humor.
it becomes.
But
Let's see, should I ring the bell? Okay. Let's see. What if I listen? Ding, ding, ding. So when Paul Ekman was doing his research in Papua New Guinea, he had some interesting sort of challenges of not leading the witness. He was kind of trying to figure out how can he actually invoke the facial expression without sort of hinting to them what facial expression he wants them to make, and all of this when he was trying to figure it out. And then he realized, oh, he could do it through telling stories. So he would tell the villagers these stories and then say, okay, now make the face that you would make if this thing was happening. And the 4 stories that he started with was, make the face that you would make if your child had died, if you were about to fight, if friends had come, or you saw a smelly dead pig. Okay, so these are the 4 stories. So what do you think was the story that this man is responding to? Yeah, friends had come, right? So the smile, same kind of smile, not one showing all the teeth, but definitely a smile. And then, oops, let's see. Uh-oh. Technical difficulties again. Oh, for crying out loud. Hang on 1 second. I need to... Sorry about that. I need to close it and open it again because I'm having technical difficulties. So you get to see my screensaver or my desktop. Okay. So what do you think the story was for this face? Yeah. So what makes you think it's the child had died? Yeah. Yeah, the mouth, and look at those eyebrows. Remember we said it sort of is the tent shape of the eyebrows that's kind of hard to make unless you're actually feeling sadness. What about this one? Yeah, about to fight. See how those lips are pressed together and the eyes are kind of glowering? And then the eyebrows are kind of lowered. Smelly pig, right? Okay, smelly dead pig. So very universal, right? We do very similar expressions. And then the other ones like contempt, you know, he studied a little bit later, but these are the pictures actually from the 60s when he was doing his research, and he said it was really, really easy because these villagers had never seen a camera. They had no idea what a camera was. So there was no self-consciousness. They just saw him lifting this black box up in front of his face all the time, and they had no idea what was happening. So they're, you know, very spontaneous when he would do that. All right, now we're going to look at the emotional episode timeline, and I've got a handout for this one so that you'll be able to follow along. Let's see, let me, if I could hand that to you, and if you could pass those around, that would be great. So remember we said that an emotion is a process, and so one of the things that we're trying to do in cultivating emotional balance is bring awareness to the process of our emotional life by breaking it down into its component parts. So we're going to look at this emotional process by way of the emotional episode timeline. And so you see it's divided into 5 different steps. Oh, great, thank you. 5 different steps. Now the first step is called the precondition. So this is before anything has really happened, before the event. You'll see at the top of step 2 is the event that leads to that trigger. But this is our state coming into the situation. So for example, for the precondition, maybe you're already feeling emotional about something, right? Maybe you're in a certain mood. Maybe you're really hungry or tired. For me, if I'm hungry and tired, I better not go into a challenging situation or it's going to be a train wreck. I know that, right? So what is your state going into that situation, that precondition? So both emotional, also includes things like what's your intention? Maybe you have a motivation for something going into that event. Maybe you have some kind of expectation, so it includes things like that too. Physical, emotional, even conceptual, right? Like something like a motivation for going in. And then the second step, you'll see the event at the top. And this can be both external and internal. Remember we said it doesn't need to be something new that happens externally. It could be a memory is part of that trigger, right? Or, you know, reliving, ruminating about something that happened before can newly make us emotional all over again. So it's either something internal or external. And then down here, this perception database. We changed some of the wording around. We used to call this the emotional alert database, which also gives you an idea of what it is. And this is both the personal and evolutionary data points that make that situation triggering for you, because you see that the trigger is a combination of the event, the precondition, and the information from that perceptual database. So I'll use an example of one of Paul Ekman's, because it's a really good example, and he was talking about this young man who he was seeing in therapy because the young man felt like he was getting very inappropriately angry when his coworkers would tease him. He had started a new job, and you know how it is with your coworkers or your friends. They just kind of tease you about stuff, and it's good-natured, and he would just flip out. And so he's seeing Paul Ekman to try and kind of unearth what's going on here, because he knew he was overreacting. His coworkers were like, whoa, dude, just kidding around. So it wasn't going well at his new job with this overreaction. Well, come to find out, when they started digging into this perception database, apparently for this young man, when he was 4 years old, when he was really young, his father would tease him in a way that was very humiliating to him. And then when he'd get upset, his father would say, oh, I was just kidding. But he'd do it kind of constantly, right? So you're 4 years old, and you're just being humiliated over and over and over again. You have no control at all. So that led to this kind of imprint for him of teasing means humiliation and triggers anger, right? He couldn't get past that. So they say for that perception database, the earlier something happens that puts data into that, and the more frequently it happens, then it's tough. It's in there. It's in there. So there's a lot of stuff that's universal and evolutionary, but then there's a lot of stuff that's personal, that goes back to our personal past. Now, our perception database is an open system. It's always being added on to, but those things that happen early in life tend to be kind of tenacious, and they're also sometimes outside of our conscious awareness, so we're not so aware of them. I had an example of a new perception database that just happened. Where I live is the mountains in Northern California, Santa Cruz. There's lots of deer, right? And you're always seeing deer by the side of the road that have been hit by cars, and there's just this fear of like, oh my gosh, especially if you're driving around at dusk. And so in April, it happened to me, and I was driving at night, and I hit a deer. It just ran right, it was just like right in front of my car. It just leaped from this embankment. It was just so horrifying. I mean, here I am, this Buddhist nun. Not only would it have ordinarily been horrifying, it was just awful. It was just awful, and it like totally crumpled my car. So now I have this new thing of like, I don't want to drive at night. I've turned into one of those old ladies that doesn't want to drive at night, especially in the mountains with the deer, and especially on that road. I've avoided that road where I hit the deer ever since it happened. I have kind of PTSD around that incident that was so traumatic. And so that's a new kind of data point, is this fear and anxiety around driving at night in the mountains on that road. Not that it's not going to happen anywhere else. I mean, there's deer all over the place. But that just happened to me in April. That's a new thing. So driving at night on that road, I'm tense now if I have to do that because of what happened. So it's an open system. We're always kind of learning new things. So all of that makes up the trigger. And then the state is your emotional state with both the physical changes. Remember we said, there can be blood rushing, sweating, your heart's pounding, whatever's happening physically, and psychological changes that go along with that emotion, right? So, memories can be triggered, different thought patterns and so forth psychologically. So that's the emotional state, is all of that, both physical and psychological changes. And then the next step is either a constructive or a destructive or both an action. So that's more your behavior then as a result of that emotion that you experience. Maybe you had a constructive, we used to call this in the old chart, we used to call it automatic reaction or mindful response. And we changed it to constructive and destructive, because it's not necessarily mindful, but maybe even you've habituated yourself to reacting constructively to an emotional episode. And then the post-condition is, how are you left feeling? What are both the internal and external impacts on you of that emotional episode? And you see this dotted line going back to the precondition, because the postcondition of one emotional episode could easily be the precondition of another one, of the next one, right? And if you feel like, for example, you've been angry for 3 days, we would say no, because anger is very short-lived, but it could be that you've been re-triggered over and over and over again, even by your memory of what happened, and that your post-condition of that anger episode left you vulnerable in terms of the precondition to be re-triggered over and over and over again. Also notice this shaded area, this selective filtering period, and during this time, any new information that comes in is filtered through the lens of that emotion that you're feeling, and so it's really hard to get any kind of, perspective, any kind of objective perspective. And I gave the example of somebody says something that makes you angry, and then they're immediately trying to apologize and smile at you. Well, you're seeing it through the lens of your anger, and you're like, oh my God, they're so manipulative. Look at them. They're just sneering at me. Instead of like, oh, they're smiling and trying to make it okay. Oh, now they're making fun of me. Now he's just laughing at me. It's filtered through that emotion that you're feeling. So one of the kind of goals of cultivating our emotional balance is to shorten that selective filtering period so it doesn't influence everything that you're perceiving afterwards. But this is why sometimes you can't make everything okay right away, because the other person is in their selective filtering period, and you're trying to apologize for something that happened, and it's not going anywhere. Anybody had that experience? You're trying to make it okay, and it doesn't work, right? That's why. So being aware also of this is what's happening for everybody in the situation, you and others as well. And that can be really helpful. So we're trying to build an awareness of our own kind of emotional life, and this helps us determine what's going on with other people's emotional, especially people that you're close to. People close to me know if I'm hungry and I'm having one of those hypoglycemic blood sugar crash things, they know to feed me, or I'm going to be a mess. So it's like nice to know for the people close to you about things like the preconditions, that selective filtering period. So questions about the diagram? Yeah.
You said to get the emotional balance, you want to shorten.
One of the things that we try and do, so we're not under the grip of that emotion that's filtering and distorting any new things that we're perceiving. That's one of the things we do. I mean, we're trying to bring awareness to all of it. But one thing that really helps, because that selective filtering period could last for days. I mean, we could hold a grudge, and it could be really long-lasting, that we're, every time we see that person, we're kind of re-triggered, and then it distorts our perception. Anything else? Okay, so what I want you to do now is get into groups of 4, and what I want you to do is map one of your own emotional episodes, and it's something that we'll share with the whole class. Now we have a confidentiality agreement. I want it to be real, I want it to be juicy. We will turn the camera off for the sharing part. But just so you know, because I taught a class recently and the people mapped out this great episode, but they didn't realize they had to come back and share it with everybody, and they're like, no, we don't want to do that. So you will share it with everyone. And write it down. I've got big pieces of paper and markers, and I want you to reproduce this for the emotion that you choose. So in your small group, share and decide. One of you has had an emotional episode. Pick one that one of you have had that maps out, write what the precondition was, write what the event was as clearly as possible, what you identified in your perception database, what were the physical and psychological changes of the emotion that you felt, were there any actions, were they constructive or destructive? So just, draw from your memory and map out an emotional episode. And this really, really helps by doing it yourself to get clarity in all the pieces of this. And then one of the things that's helpful to do is 4 very powerful emotional episodes, especially the ones that lead to destructive reactions, go back after the fact and map them out. And this is a way to really bring awareness to the emotional episodes. We do this in prisons in this group at Folsom that I taught recently. It was amazing. And this is where, even though they didn't have any trust and they were from rival gangs, they shared so much vulnerability, especially in terms of the perception database about things like abandonment. Many of them were abandoned by their parents and had to be raised in foster home. And they talked about that, and they got how much that early experience really led to them being very volatile emotionally with anger and so forth. So it can be actually quite moving, and I think they all got a lot of insight into how much those things had had an effect on their emotional life. Okay? So we'll do this. We'll go for about almost the time that we have left. We'll maybe do one before the end of the evening. Let's kind of see how people are going. Yes? Yes.
Can you pick something that you're currently experiencing?
Sure.
It doesn't have to be an event that has come and gone.
No, if you're in the middle of something, it's just important to complete it. Like, so see, is there an action? Like, it could be something that happened today, it could be something that happened right before class, but don't pick something like, if I say something right now that's triggering and you haven't really had the whole emotional episode. So make sure that you've got the latter parts of it too, like it prompted some action and maybe there's a post-condition there, but it totally could be something that happened sometime today, for sure. Yeah. Yes?
Do one example?
Yeah, okay. So let's go through the example of Paul Ekman's student, okay, of this guy who was teased by his father. So precondition, he's coming into a new workplace, right, for the first day. So he's anxious, a little bit scared, wants to make a good impression, wants to get along with the coworkers, really wants people to like him. So he's doing pretty well, and then there's the afternoon coffee break, and they're all kind of like in the break room, and somebody's like, hey dude, and teases him about his hair, right? That's the event. So the precondition is already a little bit nervous, first day at work, a little scary, vulnerable. The event is the comment about his hairstyle. Well, then this perception database is, Dad used to humiliate me by teasing me all the time when I was a kid, and I had no control, and I'd get angry, and then I'd be further humiliated about my emotional reaction to it, so it's just like a mess. So, you know, that is something that makes any teasing a trigger for him, whereas for somebody else that didn't have that experience in that perception database, they could laugh it off, right? So what happens? Anger. He feels really angry. So his heart starts pounding, that's the physical changes, he might turn kind of red. Psychological changes, he's already going to this place of like, okay, that's it for this workplace, I can't get along with these people, oh my God. Maybe fear and worry of like, what am I going to do now? This always happens, I always get so upset. Maybe he yells at the person or just says something really sharp back. So the destructive action is something verbal that he says that's unkind as prompted by his anger. And then the post-condition, all his new coworkers now are like distancing themselves from him. So the external impact is distancing from the new coworkers. The internal impact is disappointment, shame, anger, guilt, kind of a despair of like, oh, this never works out for me, it's always the same thing, like that, which can be totally triggering for the next episode. So that would be an example of how to map out something like that. Does that help? Yeah, good. All right, so get in your groups. I'll pass out the papers.